good afternoon from a sort of rather grey day in Birmingham. Welcome to the session on Moldova. My name is Katarina Woldruk and I'm Associate Fellow at the Russian and Eurasian Program, for those who don't know me. Today we are discussing the eventful sort of last couple of weeks in Moldova, which actually builds on quite an eventful several years in Moldovan politics. So basically speaking, there is never a dull day in Moldovan politics. And the latest installment is that the presidential elections have taken place, and in the runoff, Maia Sandu has emerged from the runoff elections. Maia Sandu emerged as a clear victor. What does it mean for Moldova? How the elections were conducted, especially because we are talking about the rematch from 2016, and then we had allegations of electoral fraud in favor of Igor Dodon. So what does it mean basically for Moldova from now on in terms of results? Let's not forget that a large percentage, almost half of the Moldovan electorate actually voted for Igor Dodon. So are we talking still about, despite Maia Sandu's victory, about US-style polarization? But also, what do elections, what do they mean? Because Moldova is nominally a presidential or it's a semi-presidential or parliamentary republic, depending whom you ask. And what does it mean for future domestic and foreign policy developments? So today we have two excellent speakers, but let me introduce make some few organizational points. First of all, the event is held on the record, and the full recording or parts of it may be released by Chatham House on its website. Please note that all the participants are visible if they have cameras on, but they are muted for the duration of the event. And also we will have a Q&A session at the end. Speakers are going to talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And for that, you can use the raised hand function if you go to the participants list, or you can basically if you can use the, you can use the raised hand function when it comes to the participants list, or use the chat function, the chat room, to pose your questions. And basically now it's time to introduce the speakers. We have two distinguished Moldovan experts, and they will be speaking in the following order. First of all will be Dr. Kristina Gerasimov, who is well known to many of us because she was a research fellow, Robert Bosch fellow at Chatham House, and now she's a research fellow at the DGAP, which is German Council on Foreign Relations. And she's covering the region as a whole, so I think it's a great opportunity for Kristina to speak about Moldova. And she's done work on Belarus and on Ukraine as well. So now she's returning to her sort of homeland. And our second speaker is going to be Nicu Popescu, who is the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, wider Euro program. And he focuses specifically on EU relations with Russia and the Eastern Partnership countries. Last year, he served as the Moldova's Minister for Foreign Affairs and European Integration. And he was also a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies and held numerous fellowships across Europe. He also manages to teach at the Sciences Po in Paris. Both Kristina and Nicu have authored a number of publications on the region as a whole, and so they're exceedingly well positioned to comment on the latest political developments in Moldova. So, Kristina, let's start with you. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Kasia, and thank you very much to the Russian Eurasia program for having me back on this wonderful occasion. I think it's not every day that we have good news coming from Moldova, and I'm glad that we are able to speak about that today here with you. So I think I'll start, my initial remarks from trying to see whether this time is different, or what kind of a different vibe did these election season bring about? And if you allow me, I'll start with my own experience, just because of the role of the diaspora in these elections. So for me, yes, these elections were different. I stayed in line to vote for about 4.5 hours on a Sunday morning, with an early arrival at the embassy in Berlin at 6:45, with the expectation to avoid the lines later in the day. But this was indeed a first timer in my experience to see such long lines. And I'm not so young of a voter anymore. I apologize for starting with this anecdotal story, but I think this is very representative of a phenomenon that we have not witnessed so far in such proportions, a very mobilized diaspora that came out in unprecedented numbers for Moldova's first and second round of elections. We saw around 260,000 voters casting their votes abroad. That is basically twice more than we saw in 2016's presidential elections in the second round, and 4 times more than in the first round in 2016. So we do see there an add up. This has put pressure on the staff at the polling stations, but from my own observations, they were very well prepared in both rounds, which is also confirmed by the official monitoring report. So for me, this time it was different. For President Dodon, it is different this time as well. He lost inside the country with a 2% difference to Maia Sandu, where usually there is a very tight race. He also lost in the capital, where his younger socialist counterpart, Ioan Ciobanu, won the runoff for the city hall last autumn only. There, the difference was 19% between Dodon and Sandu. And he also lost in the diaspora with an 85% difference in percentage points to Maia Sandu. For Maia, this race was also very different. She has a stronger party today than last time around in 2016. This has helped her campaign around the country and build more support. She has employed new methods for how to reach out to Moldovans. We saw a lot of targeted social media outreach, which worked. If we look, for instance, at the numbers among the youth, quite amorphous usually, but this time came out high, with 50% of those who voted for her abroad being between the ages of 26 and 40 years old. She avoided, or tried to avoid, to what she tried to do her best, geopoliticizing the vote, and campaigned on values such as integrity, unity, the necessity to address people's needs and concerns. As always, she stressed the importance of fighting against corruption, which also was a good catalyst, I think, that mobilized many groups across the country. As a result, she won everywhere except Gagauzia, Transnistria, and a few regions in the north. In the vote from abroad, she got 93%, basically, and these are numbers that probably any authoritarian leader in the region could only wish for, but she did it in a democratic setting, and I think this is remarkable. For the country, this time it's different as well, in my perspective. I think it is safe to say that this was one of the dirtiest electoral campaigns so far, something Moldovan politics is gradually experiencing more often, but never really to this degree. I mean, we've seen instances of hate speech, we've seen instances of very misogynist comments that hit new highs, divisions of people along identity lines, and so on. 2 days before the elections, we saw a march in support of President Dodon. The speeches there are supposed to be probably used in textbooks on how to promote fakes, how to promote disinformation, fear, hate, but definitely, not how to campaign in a democracy. The very heavy interference of Russian technologists in support of President Dodon was something quite new, or at least more visible this time around. We saw very high-level political endorsements and warnings to Western partners not to interfere in these elections. So indeed, Russia's influence here was big, to say the least. Its interference, however, was expected, it was expected to severely undermine the prospects for a fair electoral contest, but we saw that the efforts invested have not produced the expected outcome. We saw unusually high numbers of polling stations open in Russia, but I think among the good news, what we saw was the decision of the Central Election Committee passing the legislation to ban the transportation of voters to the polling stations. This was important because it was an issue considered to have helped President Dodon win last time around in 2016 with a very narrow margin. So here registered evidence says that the phenomenon was still present in this election, though the shape of the process changed and reduced from the numbers of those who were brought to the polling stations. So the way how the key battlegrounds in this election were played out was also very different. Based on the polls in the run-up to this election, most experts predicted a déjà vu, a very tight race. For two constituencies, basically, the diaspora and the Transnistrian region. But I think that the risks that were involved around these voter groups have mobilized significantly people also inside and outside the country to increase the chances to avoid a repeated scenario. The diaspora for the first round was turned out unexpectedly high, even more so in the second round, with 16% of the total vote. What I think, many see this as something to praise. I look at it a bit more sober, saying that this actually tells us about how many people left the country in the last 4 years in the absence of jobs and professional development opportunities. And here, a very short, another anecdote. I met recently a fresh Moldovan student in Germany here who went to a top high school in Chisinau. She told me that every single graduate but one of her cohort studies now at a university abroad. And unfortunately, I must say that this is not an exceptional year or phenomenon. The population of the country is maybe the number one challenge that needs to be tackled. In the second round, the mobilization could have been also caused by a remark of Dodon that the diaspora lives in a parallel reality. This has angered a lot of people. We saw many more coming out. In terms of the Transnistrian vote, very quickly, it is difficult to say how systematic or comprehensive the fraud was, but it's clear that it was there in smaller scale, I guess. We saw a 31,000 people casting their vote from the Transnistrian region, with 85% voting for Dodon. So the attention here was raised over the Transnistrian votes and their possible manipulation. And this left basically, or narrowed down the space for maneuver for President Dodon. Very, very quick on what does this outcome mean for the domestic political landscape. I think expectations are super high from Maia's presidency. These are shaped by very common woes in the country, starting from very poor management of COVID, no meaningful support for any category in the society, the draining of the state budget, and the creation of no meaningful economic incentives for businesses and entrepreneurs during the last 1 to 5 years, to say at least. These high expectations, we should be prepared, can trigger high disappointments as well. We do not need to forget that Moldova is a parliamentary system, which means that the president's powers are constrained mostly to the foreign and security policy realms. On domestic affairs, her mandate is very limited. She can raise to parliament issues related to the functioning of the state, on judicial reform, for instance. But the twist here, and I like saying it in the Moldovan case, is that because the president is elected directly by the people, this gives the president high legitimacy. And this is important because she can use this leverage in changing or reshaping the political landscape. But ultimately, it is upon a functioning government and legislative support in the parliament to help implement the changes that the president envisions, which at the moment are not there. So let's be cautiously optimistic about what can we expect from the next 4 years from this presidency. And on any other details, I'm glad to go into the discussion Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Christina, for this very useful overview and managing to cover so many issues, and also about this cautious warning about lowering our expectations. So now over to Niku. But just can I, before that, for our newcomers, because we have still people joining, just a reminder that this event is on the record, and parts of full recording may be released on Chatham House website. And we'll have a Q&A. You can ask questions either via the chat function or later by raising your hand, the blue hand. So over to Niku now. Please give us your overview, especially if possible, focusing on the broader sort of international situation and implications of the elections. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see so many friends on this list that I have on the right of my screen. It would have been much better to see you at the pre-panel coffee, but we'll have to make do with what we have. And I will start, and I will mostly speak about foreign policy. I think this election, just like pretty much every single election in our part of the world, is depicted in the international media as a geopolitical battle between pro-EU and pro-Russian candidates. If I look at the headlines of most of the newspapers, international newspapers about Moldova, and even if I have done probably 20 interviews yesterday, I've tried to make the point in each of these interviews, and still most of the people who spoke to me came with this geopolitical framing of these elections. Nonetheless, I will still insist on stressing that this election certainly had a geopolitical dimension, but it was not the main one. The main cleavage in these elections was between basically forces which have been credibly involved in corrupt activities. President Dodon has several videos receiving bags of cash, boasting about receiving $700,000 a month from Russia in cash, in illegal party finance. So that election to a large extent was about corruption, and also to a large extent about mismanagement of the country, not least during the coronavirus crisis. Having said that, there was a geopolitical dimension, and I'll talk about it, but it was not the main one. Especially in the early weeks of the campaign, both candidates tried to be as close to the center as possible in their foreign policy discourse. Maia Sandu has also been as centrist as possible, so she presented herself, and she actually is someone who is deeply committed to making Moldova a better governed country, by doing that, bringing Moldova closer to the European Union, and she's a firm believer and someone who hopes that she can bring Moldova into the EU. At the same time, at no point in her political career or in this campaign has she attacked Russia. She has been quite positive in trying to reach out to Russian-speaking parts of Moldova, to Gagauz. She's been several times to Gagauzia. She tried to reach out to Ukrainians, to Russians, and she had a part of her campaign speaking Russian, which has not happened frequently for center-right candidates before. And she's also been sending signals to Russia that she is willing to pragmatically cooperate in Russia, not have an ideologically tense relationship with Russia. She's looking at pragmatic ways to solving problems, some of the problems that Moldova has in its relations with Russia. In terms of future steps on foreign policy, we will enter a period of hyperactive foreign policy, this I'm very certain. In recent years, under President Dodon, Moldova has been quite isolated. Dodon was basically completely shut out from contacts with Moldova's only two neighbors, Romania and Ukraine. And he has been mostly avoided in most of the European Union and the United States. And basically the only country where he was going quite frequently was Russia. There are several reasons for that, but now Moldova is entering a phase where there is a lot of openness. There is a lot of willingness to help Moldova. Maia Sandu is someone who is very respected in Europe. Angela Merkel several times endorsed her at various stages of Maia Sandu's political career. Ursula von der Leyen as well. So now we're looking into a pretty positive outlook for Moldova's future foreign policy. A couple of words on Romania. But it was also very indicative how basically in the early hours of Monday, both the presidents of Romania and Ukraine reached out around 8 o'clock to call Maia Sandu and congratulate her. So there was a kind of pretty positive exchange. President Zelensky even called from the hospital. He's still in hospital with COVID. So in this sense, that's a completely new setting for Moldova. Now, if we look, it's important to look at how politicians position themselves, but I always stress that it's super important to look at the kind of economic, political, diplomatic, and infrastructural structures sustaining countries and political leaders. And of that, I would also like to say that Moldova has several good cards to play in foreign policy, thanks to its geography and economic links. Very often, countries like Moldova or Ukraine are depicted as being, torn between Europe and the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. But actually, in Moldova's case, especially if you look on the economic front, Moldova is deeply integrated into the European economy. Some 65% of Moldovan goods go to the EU market, and 9% go to the Russian market. That allows Moldova a very high degree of resilience in the face of any potential economic pressures. And this kind of economic statistics, they offer opportunities to leaders like Maia Sandu, but they also constrain significantly leaders, President Dodon, who of course could not really undertake any serious lasting moves to bring Moldova closer to the Eurasian Union, simply because it would have meant an economic collapse which no Moldovan leader could afford. So by saying this, I want to stress that it's very important to look at the foreign policy signaling of leaders, but some structural factors constrain these leaders. A couple of months ago, Moldova has finalized building together with Romania a gas interconnector with Romania and the EU market. So from now onwards, Moldova is connected to the European gas market, which again allows it to be resilient, not just in trade and economic terms, but also in energy terms. If we look at the future, I think it would be important to look for ways to consolidate this momentum. And on the European Union side, I think one of the possible positive steps would be to look into ways to boost the benefits that the association agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade area with the EU brings Moldova. And one logical way to look at possible next steps is that even though there is a free trade area, there are still several quantitative restrictions on several Moldovan agricultural exports. And I think it would be an interesting thing to do if Moldova and the EU could have a roadmap on the total abolition of quantitative restrictions on quotas. And perhaps already from the next year, we might look into abolishing, that's a piece of advice, we might look into abolishing, let's say, 3 or 5 tariff quotas on 3 or 5 of the most affected Moldovan exports. That would be a quick way to boost Moldova's capacity to recover from COVID. A few more words on Russia, if I have 2 more minutes. Russia has played a very visible role in this campaign, but it was also a half-hearted one. And I think it's important for us to kind of see a little bit what was the methodology of Russian support to Dodon. What happened in recent years is that Russia has actually done very little to support Dodon or to open doors for Moldova on this structural level, on trade issues, energy issues. As we speak, even under the presidency of a very Russia-friendly president like Dodon, Moldova was still paying higher prices for Russian gas than Germany did. So in this sense, what is obvious is that even though Dodon was someone who positioned himself as being very friendly to Russia, actually he did not benefit from any type of visible, for example, discounts on the price of gas. Most of the Russian embargo imposed on Moldovan goods after 2014 and the application of the association agreement to Moldova. So Russia basically suspended the free trade area under the CIS and introduced a de facto embargo and restrictions on most Moldovan exports. Now, most of those restrictions remain in place. There has been a certain relaxation on several types of products. So that's a suspension of that embargo on several types of products. But overall, most of those restrictions have stayed in place even under the presidency of Dodon. So we haven't seen a Russia that is willing to invest, if you want, into kind of a structural openness of market or offering significant economic incentives to a friendly political force. Russia went down when we had a situation back in spring where the Moldovan government and President Dodon asked for a big Russian credit. First a loan, first they asked for $500 million, then they asked for 300, and then they signed a deal, a loan agreement for $200 million. But that agreement was signed in March, but it was but the Constitutional Court in Moldova struck it down for being unconstitutional because there were some very weird provisions in that agreement. However, between May and November, Russia has not moved fast enough and deliberately has not moved to grant this loan to President Dodon. Here, we can only speculate as to the reasons, but probably this whole, Russia's own economic context, EU sanctions, American sanctions over the years might have been one of the factors that made Russia look more carefully into how much money it spends and where. And of course, one could feel that Russia was not very confident in Dodon's victory, and therefore probably they did not really want to commit to injecting that loan and not being sure who would potentially manage those funds. These are we don't know for sure, but it's visible that Russia has not really gone full force into supporting Dodon. What they did, they supported and sent political consultants, and there has been a lot of media work and political consultants work, and some of that is very controversial and is not exactly in line with the Moldovan law on the financing of political parties and campaigns. That's something which was very visible. So I'll probably stop here, and then we can develop some of these themes during the questions and answers.
Great, thank you very much for providing such an overview and bringing the economic and international dimension and seeing how it's sort of all interconnected. And both presentations raised a number of points, but we already have the first question. I would just like to remind everybody that this event is on the record, and you can ask the questions via the chat function or by raising a blue hand. So we have the first question, and it's from John Law, who is basically having done so much work on anti-corruption issues. It's not surprising that John is asking to what extent Maia Sandu can realistically, what she can realistically do on the anti-corruption front, and especially in the context of what Christina and Niku, you said. It seems that we have those opaque networks and clientelistic arrangements. Russia could feed into them. To what extent Maia is well positioned actually to operate in this rather murky world of Moldovan informal politics? Who would like to start?
I can start if I still haven't unmuted myself. Listen, basically, the Moldovan political system over the years emerged as a system where it's very, very difficult to make any sharp moves So it has lots of checks and balances that several times in Moldovan history allowed for the population and the state structures to beat back attempts at centralization of power and authoritarianism. More or less, I would say that there have been 4 such attempts in the last 30 years, and all of them have been beaten back by Moldova's system of checks and balances. But also in Moldova, it's very difficult with such a system to just come and swipe everything aside and launch major, deep reforms. That hasn't happened in Moldova either. So Moldova has been pretty good at keeping political pluralism, but pretty bad at coming with big, energetic, radical and quick reforms, as Georgia did, or even Slovakia did at different points. And so there's so in this sense, when you ask me how able will be Maia Sandu now to do any major quick reforms, I would say that of course it will be difficult, but it has always been difficult in Moldova, and you make progress through painstaking and small steps. So, the joke of the day yesterday was that from now on, it will be extremely difficult, but 2 days ago, it was even more difficult. So that's one step. She has momentum. She has a strong public support. The next stage will be to turn that public support into a new parliamentary landscape and use that landscape to govern and to conduct more reforms. That's a bit the situation. As I said, it will be difficult. In the short run, I expect the parliament to consolidate bits, to consolidate not the entire parliament, but there will be a consolidated majority in parliament against Maia Sandu. But it's a shaky and it's a small and narrow majority, and it will not last long. That I'm quite confident. So. But now she has a platform, and there are several ways she can institutionally block several abuses on the corruption front. The Moldovan presidency is basically weaker than the French, stronger than the German presidency, and it's somewhere more or less like the Bulgarian and Romanian presidency, if you want to put it in a kind of more pan-European context. So it's not the weakest presidency you have in Europe. And then we will see how do you play this? And there's a question, there's a question about whether Maia has been supported by oligarchs. No, now we have all the signs that members of parliament who have been affiliated with Plahotniuc and members of parliament who are affiliated with Shor are creating these days a new majority with President Dodon. So it's not that Maia has not received any oligarchic support. Maia Sandu is still kind of, well, actually the oligarchic networks have allied now not for the first time against, and I can guarantee you that there has been no oligarchic support to Maia Sandu's campaign. And she's someone who personally has zero tolerance to corruption, both in politics and in her entourage. And on this, I know that lots of East European politicians have said this and promised that, but I do assure you that Maia is different. Maia Sandu is different in this respect. And of course, you have all the right not to believe me, but follow Moldovan news and you will see in 3 years or 5 years that what I just told you today will remain valid, I'm sure.
Great, thank you very much, Niku. And I think your last point, how do we know what we know about Maia Sandu, and the fact that presumably by now any dirt on her would have been basically made available in the public domain. The fact that it hasn't been indicates that there is not much material to basically use against her. So yeah, we are convinced by your argument. So over to Christina. Would like to tackle this issue of the anti-corruption agenda and the oligarchs. What does it mean for her presidency?
Yeah, and I will try to build basically on what Niku has already mentioned. Look, I think if we, or for those who have closely observed Igor Dodon's presidency, there is a heightened expectation that the president can do a lot. However, that is not the case. He overtook some of the competencies that he actually does not have according to the constitution. And this is a heightened expectation that Maia could do the same. I think this is also a wrong expectation because, as Nico has mentioned, she's probably a unique case, not only in Moldova, but in the broader post-Soviet space, that not only she has zero tolerance to corruption, but there is literally no dirt that you can find against her. And this is, I think, her tool number one, her own integrity and her own approach to corruption. Is this a practical tool? Not ready unless she's able to mobilize support around her, parliamentary support and a functioning government. To be a bit more concrete, maybe, or more specific, she does have domestically this mandate to appoint judges, but only upon a list that is being presented to her by the High Council of Justices. So from this perspective, she does have, I mean, we know how important the court system is in the whole, system of fighting corruption, how important that is. But again, that is a limited tool that she can use. In terms of the influence of oligarchs over her party and the developments in her party, I think also for those who saw how her party was conceived and how it started developing, it was really a party based on volunteerism. And before they managed to enter parliament, a lot of them were doing literally voluntary work for the party. That has not broken throughout the years. And in 2019, with the parliamentary elections, they made it to the parliament. So from a political financing point of view, I fully agree here with Nico that she is clean. If you bend, you can immediately see how evidence will be brought up against you. Platforma DA is not as clean, by far not as clean as not Platforma, I'm sorry. So PPDA is Anastasis party is by far not enjoying the same image of being corruption-free that Maia's party has. So I also agree that we already see, a new coalition forming of oligarchic interests against Maia in various forms. Also very difficult to understand if we look at this jumping back and forward from the Socialist Party to the pro-Moldova party led by Sandu and so on, and then to Shore, and then to this new Pentru Moldova platform that has been created. So it's very difficult to understand, but these are all in essence oligarchic-backed forces interested to maintain the status quo. What is clear is that President Dodon has lost a lot of legitimacy. He is now probably, confronted with difficulty also maintaining his leadership over the party. There are other contestants there. Ion Chaban, who is the current mayor, also from the Socialist Party, the current mayor of Chisinau, is also quite a good alternative for the future leadership of the party. So we do see that PSRM also has issues inside. And that might, trying to project what's going to happen in Moldovan politics these last 6-12 months have proven that this is a very risky affair. And though we do see on behalf multiple parties, the lack of willingness to cooperate with the socialists and with President Dodon, it's not very clear if they will manage and how will they manage to call for early parliamentary elections. So there is political will, but it might take a while until those forces come together. And maybe I'll stop here because there are more questions that I see coming, and maybe we switch to other ones as well.
Great, thank you very much. We will come back to the issues of oligarchs and basically what's coming, but one of the speculations is about the possible parliamentary elections to ensure that Sandu has a broader sort of political platform she can rely on to push reforms. But given the context of the elections, on the one hand, you mentioned that her agenda was effective in terms of promoting integrity, people's needs, and anti-corruption. On the other hand, Christina, you mentioned it was very much identity-based polarization. So given the fairly volatile nature of the Moldovan electorate, would it be a safe choice to go for parliamentary elections and a new coalitional government? What's your take on this? Christina, as you are already unmuted, would you like to take this?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I meant that the whole campaign was polarized, not that Maia was promoting polarization. I just want to make that very clear there. We've seen a lot of instances of hate speech, based on also language, ethnicity, and I mean the whole campaign was quite dirty from this perspective. But to move on in terms of again, the early elections, indeed, as Niku has also mentioned, there is this momentum that can be capitalized. But if we look at the polls, at the most recent polls that were conducted just before the presidential elections, what we saw is that PSRM, the Socialist Party, is still enjoying the highest popularity, so about 20% support. If there were parliamentary elections next Sunday, Maia's party, PAS, enjoys about 14% of support, and we would also, have the Shore Party there joining. And I think what would be interesting here, or different, I mean, we would still have a very hung parliament, let's put it that way. So what would snap elections really change? I think a change indeed would be the entry of our party by Renato Usate, that would join the parliament. We saw that his support in the first presidential elections round was around 17%. He's becoming very popular. He's biting from the socialists' electorate spectrum, but he's a populist. So the only add-on to what we already have in the current parliamentary mess would be Renato Usate's party, and we don't know in what direction that would play. So I think many are very cautious in the sense of asking or calling for elections, though there is indeed this momentum that Maia's victory has created, and this could tweak a bit the balance more towards her party from what we've seen with the social polling ratings 1 month ago.
Great, thank you very much, Christina. Niku, any views on this particular issue of early elections?
I mean, my feeling, and that's not, as you know, politics is not subject to the laws of physics, so I can only give you my very subjective feeling. I think in the short term, as I said, there will be a certain move to consolidate on a platform in the parliament that keeps Maia Sandu in check. That's already happening, but that's not going to last very long. So I think in between 6 and 12 months, that existing and emerging current majority will enter into some kind of crisis. And then we will see either this will allow for early elections. Even if early elections don't happen, the next ordinary parliamentary elections are in 2.5 years. And that's, it's not good for the country to wait for these 2.5 years before you can go into a more functioning and more stable parliamentary majority. But if the current parliament drags its feet and resists, that will only increase the rate of new forces that will enter into the parliament with an even bigger potential majority. So I think, that would be a high price to be paid, but delaying that will be done at the peril of those opposing that trend. I also think it's very important now to stress that, and it's fair to recognize that in Moldova in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there have been corrupt pro-Europeans. But as we speak today, the pro-European forces have managed to significantly purge corruption from most of the parties on the center-right in a very systematic manner. But now it's the turn of the left-wing parties to go through a similar, if you want, self-cleaning process. I think Moldova needs that as a country. Moldova will be better governed if parties to the left and to the right are less corrupt. And it's also a chance maybe for the socialists to look ahead in the future and learn from other players in Moldova who have not reformed in time and disappeared from the political map, or have expelled high-profile but corrupt politicians and have managed to renew and receive a kind of growing popular mandate. So I think now is a good moment for some soul-searching on the socialist side. There is a conversation about that in the Socialist Party, in the kitchen still. They formally invited Dodon to re-become head of the Socialist Party. So in this sense, the short-term impulse is not great, but there are rumblings about that in the Socialist Party. So I expect also in a few months to see some moves inside the Socialist Party that will try and look at a post-Dodon future.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a number of questions still to cover, so I would like to group them a bit. And perhaps the issue of the oligarchs. What you are saying, Nico, is that parties, at least pro-European parties, have tried to clean their own image and expel the sort of corrupt members and leaders, and yet Vladimir Plahotniuc is still there. So given his, until basically now, in the last several years, this overarching role in Moldovan politics, what is his position? You've mentioned this realignment inside the parliament, which means there is to be perhaps a united bloc, which basically is going to hamper Maia's agenda. So what is the role of oligarchs, but especially Mr. Plahotniuc, but also to what extent the fact that the banking scandal has not been resolved? And the previous question about Plahotniuc was from Robert Brinkley, and this question about the banking scandal, the fact that it has not been dealt with, has it been forgotten? Or the fact that it still would need to be addressed one way or another is actually a big obstacle, because many people who have benefited from the scandal may still remain in power. So it's an obstacle, actually, if those people have a vested interest to make sure that they stay in power and the scandal is not addressed. Christina, perhaps we'll start from you this time.
Sure. Great questions. I mean, of course, we cannot say that we are fully over Plahotniuc's influence in Moldovan politics. Allegedly, he is supporting not one but several factions in the parliament. So probably he learned the lessons from using only one party, the Democratic Party, and put all his eggs only in one basket. So this time, allegedly, there is strong support on his side for multiple groups. For now, it's not an open role. It's not an it's the place that where he feels more comfortable guiding from the back. In terms of the banking scandal and where is it now, I think there was a little bit of more momentum built when the new prosecutor general Stoyanoglu was appointed, and there were a lot of questions and a lot of civil society kind of pressure to make sure that that is not forgotten. I think what we saw from the prosecutor general is that he highlighted very clearly his administrative constraints in terms of resources, very few numbers of prosecutors able to work on this very, very complex case. At that point, it was still not clear whether it's only administrative resources that keeps him backwards from pursuing this case in more detail, or there is more. I think now what we see, based on a few actions and statements that he has made, it's clear that he was either given an order not to pursue this, or to take no action basically on this case. I think that was pretty clear, or at least the fact that we cannot expect much from the new prosecutor general was made very clear when there were some tapes leaked with President Dodon taking cash from Plahotniuc the day before Plahotniuc left, or before basically the socialists and Platforma Da struck a deal last summer, not this summer, but summer of 2019. He basically being presented, the prosecutor general being presented with this evidence and materials, he said that, he's not in the position these are political issues, and he's not in the position, he shouldn't be dealing with this. So basically he said that he will stay away from this. So it's clear that we cannot expect anything from the law enforcement institutions in terms of progress on this case. So it's pretty much forgotten, though the media try to keep it or bring it back to the attention, as well as civil society watchdogs that are trying to do the same.
Right, great, thank you, Christina. Nico, would like to shed some of your views on this, provide some of your views on this question?
Yes, there's, for example, one question that I perhaps, as you could see, there's almost nothing we disagreed so far with Christina. So probably it's more useful if, instead of reiterating what Christina said, I will move on to other subjects. But one of the questions that I see there is related to campaign finance regulations. And I think what is important to understand is that actually, we don't have major problems with the regulations themselves. We have a big problem with their enforcement and the capacity of state institutions to apply the law on financing election campaigns, on the financing of political parties. Now, let me give you one example, which I kind of quoted. So there is this video of former President Dodon now, who talks about receiving $700,000 in cash per month from abroad, per month. Multiply that by 2, it gives you $8.4 million a year of a cash injection into Moldovan politics. But Moldova has roughly 2.5 million people. Okay, let's put it at 3. So for a country like the UK, which is 60 million, multiply the 8.4 by 30. So the UK is 30 times bigger than Moldova population-wise. Multiply what Moldova gets as illegal cash injunctions into its political system, and you'd get something like $170, $180 million injected if any state would be trying to influence British politics. They'd be injecting, for this injection to be comparable to what Moldova has to face, that would mean an injection of illegal cash of $180 million a year into UK politics. Now, imagine what would happen to UK politics if any country would inject $180 million into UK politics. That's something Moldova has to grapple with. And the problem is that the Moldovan state institutions are quite weak in trying to apply the law on this kind of challenges to the functioning and to the fair functioning of the political system. So in recent weeks, we've had, for example, questions have been raised about campaign finance. There have been specific people and political advisors photographed in the Socialist Party headquarters, working on behalf of a party, not being declared to the Central Election Commission. And the prosecutor's office said that they don't want to get involved in politics, so they will not be investigating whether campaign finance rules have been breached. So this is where we have a problem. That's the bad news. The bad news is that the state institutions as a whole are not strong enough and are still too fearful to apply the law indiscriminately on vis-a-vis the political players. At the same time, this campaign also showed that there are significant pockets of state institutions that have acted fairly in this campaign. And there were several of them. Christina mentioned that the Central Electoral Commission, for example, a couple of weeks before the elections, banned the busing of voters on election day. So they introduced a regulation which only allows you to have 8 people in your car on election day. So you cannot bus voters. So you cannot bus voters from Transnistria, and that dramatically limits the capacity to conduct large-scale fraud. Of course, you need the police to apply the rule, but some police apply, some police doesn't apply, but there was no unity of authoritarian command. Some courts struck down, one court actually the Saturday before the election basically declared that some of the campaign leaflets of Dodon contained false information about Maia Sandu, and he was supposed to withdraw them. So we had some courts acting fairly. The foreign ministry organized a super sophisticated logistical campaign, making it possible for the diaspora to vote. So of course, Dodon did not have an interest to see large turnout among the diaspora, but nonetheless, the foreign ministry organized the voting process in a way that allowed a huge number of people to vote. So 262,000. So for example, last year in Romania, there was 700,000 Romanian diaspora citizens voting. But on a per capita basis, for Moldova to organize with decent voting for 260,000 people, that's an enormous logistical challenge. And there were problems with lack of ballots in several polling stations, and people queued for 3-4 hours. But nonetheless, with the existing capacity, the MFA has done an effort to organize these elections in a way that certainly did not serve President Dodon. So you had several pockets of state institutions which did what they do. So now the challenge for someone like President Maia Sandu, President-elect Maia Sandu, is to build on these pockets of fair and decently functioning institutions, and just to enlarge their capacity to manage Moldova in the way Moldovans want their country to be managed.
Great, thank you very much for all those insights. And now we've got more, the questions are coming, and we will come back to some of the questions which we have online already, but let's move to foreign policy for the time being. And especially as been observed, for example, by Christina Reul, that what can we expect in terms of foreign policy? So there's a particular interest in terms of relations with Russia. how Maia Sandu is going to manage that tricky relationship, given that we may also have a parallel foreign policy in terms of actually President Sandu being running foreign policy in parallel with the government. And to what extent the incoming president has free hand and can deliver unilateral action, or is she going to be constrained by domestic considerations when it comes to take any foreign policy initiatives? Nico, would you like to start on this set of issues?
So Russia, that will be a complex relationship. We all know it. Maia Sandu's starting point, while she was in government and while she was campaigning and while she is preparing to take over the presidency, and she's mentioned these things several times yesterday in several interviews, is that she wants a relationship with Russia that is pragmatic and is based on mutual respect. And she wants to focus on trying to solve several problems that have accumulated in this bilateral relationship. So she will do her best to do that. But of course, it doesn't depend only on her if this kind of positive signaling will lead to a positive relationship. The truth is that we don't know. But I think there are several parameters that might make this possible. I can maybe elaborate on that or not. But we also know that last year, when Maia Sandu was in government, the relations with Russia were quite positive. And there was a lot of respectful diplomacy. And Maia Sandu, I was preparing with Maia's team a visit to Moscow that fell through because the government fell. So we will see what happened, but for now, I don't see really a lot of negative baggage in the interaction between Maia Sandu when she was prime minister or a presidential candidate and Russia. So that's a kind of cautious hope and belief that there are several things that might make this relationship not too sulfurous, as we've seen in the relations Russia had with other, be it Moldovan leaders or leaders in the region. Now on parallel foreign policy, I don't see a lot of capacity for parallel foreign policy. It's true that President Dodon now controls parts of the state apparatus, but actually the reality is that the natural instinct and what the absolute majority of Moldovan diplomats would want to do and plan to do, and the way they have been conducting their job in the last almost 30 years, is much closer to what Maia Sandu stands for. President Dodon, former President Dodon, now has had a very difficult and conflictual relationship with the MFA, with most Moldovan diplomats throughout the years. Even while he was president, he was not in a position to rely on the MFA, and so now you don't have almost any capacity to run a parallel foreign policy. And even today, the number of positive messages I received from within the MFA, which is technically part of the government, but in reality, if you look at my WhatsApp, you'll see that significant parts of the MFA are looking forward to be run by Maia Sandu rather than Igor Dodon. Makes me confident that there is no danger of a parallel foreign policy. There might be some statements coming from Dodon and some of his associates, but that will not amount to any significant foreign policy implemented by the MFA itself and by the ambassadors and the diplomatic missions abroad.
Great, thank you very much. Christina, any points on those questions?
Well, I mean, speaking after Nico, who was a foreign minister with Maia, I don't know what I could add more on what you already said. I mean, what I fully agree in the sense that it will be a complicated relationship with Russia, but Maia has stated on numerous occasions that she's not going to hide on it. The centrist approach that she took in this electoral campaign made it very clear that she's ready to commit, to work with Moscow. Here, she did it also because the Russian market is still important for those producers who export about 8-9% to the Russian market. Russia is still an important labor market for a lot of Moldovan migrants. So it's not that, we're not going to see any working relations. I think what we won't see is a strategic partnership that President Dodon was trying to suggest as his alternative if he was granted a second term. So I think on foreign policy in terms of relations with Russia, I would stop here.
Right, thank you very much. We still will probably come back to foreign policy, but for the time being, let's group some questions on Sandu's leadership style, because Nico has made a number of sort of positive comments. Christina, you said that she avoided this electoral polarization, trying to build a unifying message for the Moldovan electorate as a whole. And Orysia Lucevich would like to get ask you for more insights on her leadership style. My own impression is that at least some people in civil society in Moldova found Maia Sandu certainly, very professional with integrity, high integrity, and yet not very much a people's person. So her communicating skills on a sort of a personal level, perhaps some people felt were not so strong. And what kind of international role model she could basically base her presidency on. And some people are wondering whether Dalia Grybauskaitė from Lithuania, the former Lithuanian president, is someone that we can may compare Maia with. And the question of female leadership, not only in the post-Soviet space, but on the European arena, to what extent Maia, being a female leader president, may benefit from support from some powerful European leaders like Angela Merkel. Germany is very keen, or has been very keen on Moldova. Merkel even visited Moldova. So is Maia Sandu possibly going to get a boost from European attention, which other Moldovan leaders haven't had? Christina, as you are online already, let's start with yourself.
Sure, and I'm very curious to also hear Nico's comments here. Look, I think Maia's entry into Moldovan politics was more of a symbol rather than a true politician at the very beginning when that happened. But I think that was a long time ago. And since then, she has developed her leadership style and the way how she communicates and, how she deals with political forces around her. I think it's easy to judge when you look from a side, but knowing how, how scarce is trust as a coin, as a bargaining chip in Moldovan politics, it's very difficult to know who to trust and who not to trust. So from this perspective, the criticism that she usually receives is that, she is feeling much more comfortable with a very kind of small group of people that she trusts, and this is kind of her core of her decision making. I'm unable, and I would not probably like to comment on this, just because I haven't been a politician in Moldovan settings, but I know how difficult it is to trust people around you, in particular in the absence of functional public institutions. When you have to trust the person rather than being able to rely on the public office that person holds, it's very difficult to be able to explain how would you behave in such a situation. So I would say her political leadership style is constantly evolving. At Chatham House, many of you had the chance to see her this March, just before COVID hit in, and I think it made a very clear, impression that she has learned a lot from her last years around Moldovan political sharks. In terms of her, on the gender aspect around her, around her presidency, I think and what kind of significance this is for Moldova. I think, we see in Moldova quite a significant number of women that are actively active in politics, but of course not at this level. She is the first president. But we also see that, these traditional gender role beliefs are still very much ingrained in Moldovans' mentality. I think by becoming a first Moldovan president, she's breaking a lot of rigid glass ceilings that only a few women could achieve in the post-Soviet space so far. And of course, this gives hope to a lot of women who see or who are interested in pursuing a professional career. Will that help her among other female leaders in Europe? I don't think it would make a difference whether they are female or not. We've seen, in July last year, when she became prime minister, that, you had this automatic opening and very good will coming from European politics, generally from Western policymakers. And I don't see that this time it would be in any way different. If you look at how many have already congratulated her immediately after the results were announced, you'd see that she would not have an issue to break the isolation that President Dodon brought Moldova in for the last 4 years. And maybe Nico wants to add here.
Great. Thank you, Christina. And now over to Nico.
On leadership style, for that we need a Chatham House, for Chatham House rules to apply. But what I could tell you now is that she's very collegial with lots of people, not with everyone, but with lots of people. I mean, it also depends on which subjects you interact. But basically, the way I worked with her is that foreign policy was evolving in a way that seemed dynamic and positive. So we didn't have a lot of problem solving to do on that front. So normally, I would update her very briefly on what happens if I had questions, or I would inform. We didn't spend hours talking about these things. When she was in government as prime minister, she spent most of her quality time as prime minister on looking into justice sector reform. That really took hours a day of talking to people, meeting, going through documents, preparing legislative changes. Much less time went into foreign policy, which was on a good dynamic. But when doing so, it means very brief and to the point conversations. In 2-3 minutes, you can update, you can kind of set the direction for several days ahead and just work on delivering it. So in this sense, it's a kind of very no-nonsense politician. You sit down, 2 minutes exchange, and then we go back to work. Very focused during the day, but also a good sense of humor. When the government fell, we all ordered pizza and bought beers, and the whole government and several advisors went into her office and spent a few hours of quality time chatting and joking, and that was something that we unfortunately, well, not joking on the political situation, but finally spending some personal time as a team, because while being in government, we actually didn't have a lot of time to do this kind of relaxed socializing. On the female leadership aspect, listen, Moldova has had so far 2 female prime ministers and 2 female speakers of parliament, and now Moldova has a president. So I think Moldova does reasonably well in terms of, maybe it's not good for a man to say this, but statistics suggest that we haven't done very badly by average European standards. There are multiple problems, but I think, when it comes to women's rights, you have a much problem with, bigger problems with violence and this low-level harassment and disrespect. But in politics, women have played a very prominent and major role, and a very positive one. That also was one of the channels through which Moldova has received support. Yes, from Angela Merkel, but also, as I said, there has been an endorsement even during this election campaign from Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Even one parenthesis in this conversation is that a year ago we went to DC, to Washington, in a delegation with Maia and Sandu and half of the government. And we met Vice President Pence, but we also met Ivanka Trump, who was ambassador at large for the promotion of women's rights. And we had a really, really good, substantial discussion on how to empower women. And at some point, we planned that maybe we could do something together with Ivanka Trump's work to see whether we can do some joint projects empowering women in Moldova. And she was giving some really fascinating and interesting examples of her work in Latin America, and some of that experience was interesting and useful for us. So, I know that the former now US president doesn't necessarily elicit a lot of enthusiasm in large parts of Europe, but such things, if you can do them for a country like Moldova, and you can use also the attention that goes into these objectives for a country like Moldova, I think that's very positive. And even on that front, I could tell you that there was goodwill on which to help Moldova.
Thank you so much for those insights. You really provide, some color to the discussion with Ivanka Trump. And now we are basically, we need to start wrapping up. So if you've got any final questions, please feel free to ask them or to send them via the chat function. But we still have unfinished business in terms of our discussion, and there is a big sort of two questions about euphoria versus pessimism. Perhaps we'll leave them for the final round of basically discussion. But for the time being, we still have questions, including one from myself, about Russia and Eurasian integration. And this goes back to the question of a dual or parallel foreign policy. And the fact is that, as Tony van der Togt reminds us, Moldova is an observer, has an observer status in the Eurasian Economic Union. What does it mean now for that particular sort of strand of Moldova's foreign policy? But also, Nico, I was puzzled by your basically observation that Russia didn't really work hard to make sure that Dodon stays in power. And was it because Dodon, perhaps some parallels, very vague, loose parallels with Yanukovych, just was not the politician they could do much with, or they didn't think that with the president they should bother and invest too much. So why half-hearted? Was it because Russia has other concerns at the moment, or they just didn't think it was worth to support Dodon to a large extent? And perhaps the final subcomponent of this question, Russia didn't offer that much when Dodon was in power, but there is still perhaps some scope for punishing Moldova for its choice of the president. But you've said the economic ties have been disrupted, so it's not that much that Russia can do actually. So what can we expect in terms of Russia's response to Moldova, given the state of play at the moment? Niku, let's do it again. You are on now and muted, so how about if you start?
Just to kind of nuance a bit what sounded to be my message, but Russia invested quite a lot in several streams of activity, mostly directed at kind of targeted support for political party and a specific politician. So if you look at the, how much, and by this I mean media work and media support, political consultants, teams of political consultants, and as President Dodon, former President Dodon now himself said, financial support going to his party. And this I haven't seen myself, but I do trust if a potential recipient advertises such financial support. By Moldovan standards, and I gave you numbers, that's huge. That's a lot. That's building an enormous asymmetry, financial asymmetry, media asymmetry, for the capacity to compete fairly among political forces. So especially for a country that is as small as Moldova and has very little, alternative capacities to finance parties or to finance the media through, advertising markets, this is having a huge corrosive effect on politics. What Russia didn't do is to invest large sums of money and support for the economy through investments, through infrastructure, through other means. And on this, I think one of the most striking parallels that I had in my mind also with President Yanukovych, for example, was that also President Yanukovych, even though he signed up for prolonging Russia's lease of the Black Sea Fleet until 2042, and received at the Kharkiv agreement, received a $100 discount per 1,000 cubic meters of gas. Even after that discount, President Yanukovych's Ukraine used to pay more for Russian gas than Germany at the time. So in this sense, and we've also seen Russia trying to minimize economic support to Belarus over the years. So overall, I do think there is a pattern where Russia has focused, or seems to have focused much more on targeted support for political partners, but has been generally trying to dry up larger scale economic and infrastructural investments and support for many of the countries that are neighboring Russia or are in the wider region as Moldova is, and Moldova is not neighboring Russia. So in this sense, I do think that yes, there is a trend there. At the same time, I would again urge everyone not to look at politics as only at this swinging pendulum between leaders. And Moldova has had wild swings of foreign policy messaging. But under these wild swings, from Voronin to Vlad Filat, to Igor Dodon, to Plahotniuk, to Maia Sandu, among these wild swings, I see that especially in the last 15 years, Moldova's kind of as a platform, not as the noise that happens on the top of the iceberg, has been shifting irreversibly and slowly but firmly into the kind of being more and more connected with Europe. Even in the last few years. And it's in the last few years that trade with Europe continued to grow, right? Moldova has been year by year diversifying partly its wine exports, but partly diversifying its exports away from wines into other better kind of, more industrialized goods, which also go to the European Union. So all of these structural trends, and I know, Katerina, that you've spent a lot of time looking at the political economy of all of these structural trends, they are pulling Moldova constantly, day by day, irrespective of the political noise that many politicians produce. And it's pulling Moldova into Europe. And just look at trade statistics from one year to another, and now energy statistics are following that, migration statistics, visa-free statistics, diaspora voter turnout statistics. All of that makes Moldova And that's partly to build on James Nipsey, Nixie, devil's advocate. This time is different. Well, as I said, it will be very difficult. But I think what is different is this trend is much deeper than the pendulum of Moldovan politics. This pendulum has wild swings, but this larger boat called the Republic of Moldova has been moving into the same direction for more or less 15 years. And those at the helm of this boat have tried to kind of change course as Dodon did, and it didn't work, or they can try and accelerate that course. And that's the hope now in this new political phase.
Great, thank you very much, Niku, for tackling that big question, but also already starting to answer the final question, which is basically where do we position ourselves between this sort of sense of euphoria versus pessimism. So basically, James is sort of devil advocate, pessimist at the moment, and you. What is noticeable, you are two diaspora Moldovans. And one of the questions which was earlier in the discussion was, there is this sense of actually the change is coming, but what kind of hope do Moldovans need, especially professional Moldovans, to return, or people doing all kinds of jobs across the European continent and in Russia to return to Moldova? What would it take to entice the people, and is it essential for Moldova to, to lift itself from the relatively sort of slow economic performance at the moment? So euphoria versus pessimism. Is Moldova different? Are going to things change? What's your take on this?
I don't think we're not on the same page here with James. I think both Nico and I said that we have caution, kind of like reasons for cautious optimism, and we do see some changes, gradual changes, transformational changes. But of course, we have, the same deep structural problems that we deal with forever. Very weak rule of law, very weak public institutions, vested interest in politics, and so on. But they are very dynamic, and we could have sat today together and discuss what would mean the second mandate of President Dodon's presidency, but we didn't. And I think this was an expectation that very few. And yes, the hopes were high, but if you analyzed the odds, it was very, very tight race there. In terms of what would bring the diaspora home, or what would bring them hope, I think this is not, more than what everyone would expect to have opportunities for professional development. Basically, having jobs at home that would allow you a decent living standard comparable to more or less what you have to your neighbors, more to the West. And from this perspective, I think Moldova is a very small country which is being pulled more by the gravitational forces of Europe, be it economic or cultural. And from this perspective, I see that for to create change for 2.7 or 3 million people on its territory is not rocket science. It's about political will, and this political will is gradually building force. If we looked, 10 years ago, yes, we did have new political elites. So we did have the new Filat, the new, Dorin Kirtoacă and so on. But they were extremely inexperienced, and the institutions, the accountability that they were, missing there, derailed this whole European integration process for the country for the last 10 years. But if we look at the workings of it, we do see that there are these, as I call them, gravitational forces that are making Moldova becoming closer to Europe. So from this perspective, I think there is cautious hope, and it should stay there.
Great.
Stop
Thank
here.
you very much, Christina, for this well-informed and cautious optimism. And we are almost out of time. So Nico, the final minute for you to position yourself on the final question. So perhaps even 45 seconds.
And the final question is, as I said, it will be difficult, and it will last not even 10 years. It will last longer. Look, I mean, Poland and Romania and Bulgaria have still a lot of unfinished business. And for us, it's still a struggle that will last decade. The important thing is to move in the right direction, not to prolong those difficult decades. And that is one step forward, and everyone is very realistic of how difficult it is going to be. But again, it's going to be easier than it looked 3 days ago.
Great, thank you very much for once again this sort of cautious optimism, and also drawing on so many aspects to basically paint a very nuanced but also informative picture of where Moldova is going, and taking us just before the last couple of days, but the longer term pattern in the past and in the future. Thank you so much. You've just whetted my appetite, because there were other questions, and I do apologize we couldn't tackle, for example, on Transnistria. So perhaps another session on Moldova in 6 months' time perhaps would be very useful to catch up on things. So thank you very much to the two excellent speakers who brought the formidable expertise to our roundtable, and for the audience to ask very insightful and relevant questions. So thank you very much, and all the best to you and Moldova in the meantime. Thank you.